Welcome everyone to our second session of reading the Bible rebelliously. We are gathered in the Commons of De La Salle North Catholic High School, as well as on Zoom. And so I'm so glad that you're here with us tonight. There's lots for us to learn. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dave Gregory, our facilitator and teacher. As you know, Dave is a theology teacher here at De La Salle. And so, Dave, thanks so much.
Yeah. So I figured we'd start with the traditional Lasallian prayer, which I did not put in the slides. Should I take my mask off? What do you think?
Yeah, you can.
Yes.
Okay. Are you okay with that?
Somebody bring their baby to the
Cool. It'll be easier because you could read lips also. That might help. So I didn't put the traditional Lasallian prayer in the slides, but what St. John Baptiste used to do, which he learned it in seminary, was a call and response prayer. So it goes, let us remember, and then we all say that we are in the holy presence of God. And then we'll kind of sit in silence for 30 seconds, recalling that at all times and in any given place, we are being created. And then it concludes, I'll say, live Jesus in our hearts, and then you all go forever. So let us remember that we are in the holy presence of God.
Sounds like went off.
No, they're having.
St. John Baptiste de La Salle, pray for us. Live Jesus in our hearts forever.
Forever.
Y'all can hear me okay?
Yep.
Cool. So I'm going to speak more to the camera because there are way more people there. Yeah, you can share the screen. Thank you, God, sir. So today we are looking at the book of Exodus, and more importantly, the Deuteronomic Code, which I will explain in a little bit. And all of this we're doing through the lens of liberation theology. So briefly, I want to recap what we did in session one. I'll introduce the book of Exodus and liberation theology. Then we'll get into the commandments, and we'll have small group discussion around the commandments. And then we'll look at Matthew 25 and think about the gospel in the context, as I cover the camera with my thumb. We'll think about the context of what Jesus preached about salvation through the lens of the Jewish approach to living out the commandments in a relationship with God. And then we'll conclude with a large group discussion and some Q&A. So here we are. Mildly awkward that the C got cut off from the end of Deuteronomic. Should have caught that before. But these are our two main ideas tonight. We're looking at the book of Exodus through the lens of liberation theology, and then thinking about the notion of orthopraxy. Many of us growing up in the church have heard of orthodoxy, orthos dokeo, right belief. But we'll think about the Jewish tradition's invitation into a different approach to religion. Anyway, I'll leave it there. So a brief recap. The entire Hebrew Bible was written after the Babylonian exile of 586, 587 BC. This event where the Babylonian Empire wiped out the nation of Judah, destroyed, my baby's crawling on the floor under my feet, destroyed the temple, took a bunch of the inhabitants of Judea into slavery, slaughtered the rest, and whoever wasn't slaughtered or taken into slavery was scattered outside of Judea. And so what we find when we read the Bible through the lens of the Babylonian exile is that the entire thing was written as rebellion against Babylonian mythology and culture and religion. So in the creation mythology of Genesis, it's the only mythology in the ancient Near East that affirms the goodness of God, the goodness of creation, and the goodness of humanity. The story of Noah's Ark. Every ancient Near Eastern culture has its own mythology around a great flood. But in the story of Noah's Ark, and we didn't cover this, but I want to kind of explain a little bit. In the story of Noah's Ark, the emphasis in it is on the fact that God floods the world because he is discontent with injustice and evil. It's grown out of hand. And half the story, when you look at the word count, is about the covenant, this promise of everlasting relationship that God will not flood the world ever again, which does not happen in any other ancient flood mythology. The binding of Isaac, we tend to think of as God's testing Abraham's faith, which is kind of stupid. Like if God told me, hey, I want you to throw your son off a roof in order to prove how much you love me, I would think I was nuts. But the Babylonian Empire, at the central temple in Babylon, would sacrifice children and human beings. And when we know that, right, that the Jews, when they were enslaved in Babylon, saw human beings being sacrificed in the temple, the story of the binding of Isaac becomes something totally different. Then it's a prohibition against human sacrifice. The Tower of Babel, well, that's a clear reference to the temple where human beings were sacrificed in Babylon. And the tower is never built. It's an inappropriate and quite evil and cruel way to try to approach the divine. So when we know that the Bible was written after the Babylonian enslavement and exile, the entire thing becomes something totally different. Today, we're approaching the book of Exodus, which is largely fictionalized. I will say from the get-go, we have evidence in Egyptian hieroglyphics that they had enslaved people from the land of Yehud. However, there is no archaeological, there's no textual evidence, there is no anthropological evidence of a massive enslavement and a massive exodus from the land of Egypt. Massive.
Somebody needs to mute.
Uh-oh, somebody's sneezing. Had such a massive exodus happened, surely the Egyptians would have written about it. But all we have is a little bit of textual evidence that the Egyptians talked about their slaves from Yehud. But the questions of historicity aside, what we need to understand is that the book of Exodus is really the foundational text of the Hebrew people. It is about a God who liberates people from slavery. So, yeah. So James Cone, who's one of the preeminent theologians of the 20th century, he's known as the father of African-American liberation theology. He died a few years ago, but in an article he wrote, which I posted on the website, I pulled a couple quotes from this because I want us to see how clearly the book of Exodus is connected to Black theology. So Cone wrote, while whites use their cultural perspective to dominate others, Blacks use theirs to affirm their dignity and to empower themselves to struggle for justice. The major reason for the differences between Black and white reflections on God is found at the point of the great differences in life. And so Cone's point is that throughout its history, the white Christian church has made a white Jesus, a blue-eyed, blonde-haired Aryan version of the incarnate God. And this has enabled the white church to colonize, to conquer, to let itself literally enslave people in the name of God. And Cone's point is that Black Christianity grew up from the experience of slavery. So he wrote, as white theology is largely defined by its response to modern and postmodern societies of Europe and America, usually ignoring the contradictions of slavery and oppression in Black life, here's the key line: Black religious thought is the thinking of slaves and of marginalized Blacks whose understanding of God was shaped by the contradictions that white theologians ignored and regarded as unworthy of serious theological reflection. So, given that the Black church emerged from the experience of slavery, their experience of hope in God was very different, right, than a comfortable upper middle class white dude like myself. My image of God growing up would be radically different. So he writes, Black slaves' hope was based on their faith in God's promise to protect the needy and to defend the poor. Just as God delivered the Hebrew children from Egyptian bondage and raised Jesus from the dead, so God will also deliver African slaves from American slavery, and in due time will bestow upon them the gift of eternal life. That was why they sang, soon I will be done with the trouble of the world, soon I will be done with the trouble of the world, going home to live with God. And when we look at the hymnody of the slave spiritual from several hundred years ago, many songs written by slaves were based on the book of Exodus and the prophetic writings, which we'll get more into next time. But for now, suffice it to say that the slave spiritual, grounded in liberation theology from the book of Exodus, influenced jazz, blues, R&B, hip hop, so much of what we consider as quintessential and truly unique American music is the result of the book of Exodus being taken seriously by people in slavery. And so Black slaves' faith in the coming justice of God was the chief reason why they could hold themselves together in servitude and sometimes fight back, even though the odds were against them. The ideas of justice, liberation, and hope should be seen in relation to the important theme of love. Theologically, God's love is prior to the other themes, but in order to separate Black reflections on love from a similar theme in white theology, it is important to emphasize that love in Black religious thought is usually linked with God's justice, liberation, and hope. God's love is made known through divine righteousness, liberating the poor for a new future. And so when we think of the white Christian church, we often hear of God's reign, God's kingship, right? And these are the languages, these are vocabularies from the ideology of colonization and sovereign rule. Whereas African Americans and Africans who were enslaved in the early American colonies had a very different approach, very different imagination concerning what God's love was about. It was about liberation, not the conquering of others, not the prosperity gospel. And so, so how can those of us who have never experienced political, religious, sexual, racial, or other systematic oppression and invisibilization engage the Bible as a text whose thumping heart is about liberation? This takes, in the words of one friend, heart work. Those of us who grew up in a very white church need to come to terms with the fact that, like, maybe we've gotten a skewed understanding of what the Bible is about. Here's the not so fun fact of the day. We have copies of the Bible given to slaves, and slave masters removed 90% of the Hebrew scriptures and 50% of the New Testament because so much of the Bible is about liberation from slavery. It's wild. So yeah, much of the Bible is about liberation. So when we think about the Ten Commandments, first of all, if you look at the reading, which I think Rio, if you could post that in the chat. Thank you. So when we think of the Ten Commandments, notice that Exodus chapter 20, it opens with, then God spoke all these words. In Hebrew, the word is devarim, which means words or sayings, not mitzvot, which means commandments. And so these are the 10 sayings, the 10 words of God. And so one professor of mine said, like, the 10 commandments were written for a middle-aged Jude going through a midlife crisis, because it says, honor thy father and thy mother, but also do not covet your neighbor's wife. So he's got to be young enough that his parents are alive, but old enough to have a spouse, right? And a wife. So it's a middle-aged Jude. And so, but when we think about the commandments, what would the world be like if we lied all the time, if we stole all the time, if we cheated all the time? It would be a mess. The 10 Commandments are really the building blocks of a well-functioning society. These are not draconian rules. These are, most of them, kind of the vast majority of human cultures through space and time have abided by some version of these. What I really want to pay attention to, though, are the 603 other commandments. Those of us who grew up going to church have heard the 10. All right, so I've never murdered. I don't cheat on my wife. I don't steal. They're relatively easy to follow. But there are 603 other commandments about everything from property and sex to eating. A lot of them have to do with ritual purity, sacrifice in the temple. In essence, the commandments are about establishing right relationship, maintaining, existing in right relationship with the world around us. The 10 commandments are kind of simple. The 603 are way more interesting, especially when we consider the commandments about the Anawim. And this is what we're focusing on tonight. The commandments about the Anawim and the less popular 603 other commandments. I joke with my freshmen when I teach this, that their final exam, they're gonna have to memorize all 613 commandments and write them down. And then I say 2 people have peed their pants when I say that, which is not true, but it makes them laugh. And so when we talk about the Deuteronomic Code, when we read the 4 books that follow the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we get 613 commandments. Altogether, these are called the Deuteronomic Code. And so these are all in the readings, but I want to run through them a little bit because there are some really interesting things to highlight. A lot of our civil legal code concerning property comes from the Judean tradition of property. So like Hammurabi's code, one of the most famous legal codes in antiquity, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that can be interpreted as, well, you hurt me, I'm going to hurt you back in equal measure. But when you think about it, it was really about making sure that people did not seek retribution in greater proportion than the damage they received. So if you take my eye, I can take your eye, but no more, right? Viewed that way, Hammurabi's code becomes something that imposes a bit of civility on a retributive approach to justice. And so a lot of the code about property comes from other ancient Near Eastern codes. For example, this kind of silly one. If someone leaves a pit open or digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution, giving money to its owner, but keeping the dead animal. And you can swap out anything, right? If I leave spikes in front of my house and my neighbor's dog stumbles into them, I don't know why there would be spikes, but you get what I'm saying. If I put up scaffolding over a construction site and something falls on an animal or on a person, basically I have to pay them. I have to compensate them for what they have suffered. But in paying them, I get to keep whatever I harmed. And we take this for granted. This is basic civil law. When we read about slaves in the Bible, we have to understand that a lot of slavery in the Bible was kind of like indentured servitude. So if somebody owed me money, but they couldn't pay me back, they could work for me. Now, this is absolutely crucial that we understand this. Exodus chapter 21, when a slave owner strikes the eye of a male or female slave, destroying it, the owner shall let the slave go, a free person, to compensate for the eye. If the owner knocks out a tooth of a male or female slave, the slave shall be let go, a free person, to compensate for the tooth. Guess what commandment American slave owners left out of the Bible as they gave their slaves? This one, right? Like, it prevents people from harming their servants who were paying them back with labor. So when we think of slavery in the Bible, we have to understand that it was a very different animal from like the chattel slavery that defined the early American colonies. I'm not saying it was good, but it was part of ancient economy. Any questions so far? Okay, well, if there are questions, feel free to unmute and ask. Yes.
Well, it's not exactly a question or a commentary. My understanding is that at that time, back then, many civilizations used a form of slavery to produce for their society.
Totally. I had a political science professor who said the only reason why we don't have slavery now is because of technology.
Right,
Because we have dishwashers and we have machines that farm for us.
right.
Imagine a world in which we didn't have these things. We would still totally have unpaid labor. Totally.
Well, we're still doing some countries like China.
Yeah. And even in this country, we have like the privatized prison industrial complex.
Yeah.
Entirely a form of slavery. Commandments about sex. These are I love how all this is in one go.
Can I ask?
You
one
shall not
question?
lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. You shall not have sexual relations with any animal and defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman give herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. It is perversion. So it's like no non-vaginal intercourse with a human or with an animal. It's gross. However, this is probably, maybe, I don't want to speak in absolutes or hyperbolas, but this has done more damage to Christianity than almost anything else in Scripture. This, I need to drive this point home. And when I teach this to students, I tell them, I teach this for the queer kids in the room. This is not about homosexuality. In ancient Near Eastern culture, there is no such thing as the spectrum of sexuality. We see this in like some Arab countries where non-vaginal intercourse is a capital offense that you can be executed by the state for. The Bible never talks about homosexuality. What this is about in the historical context is to prevent two things. One, military campaigns that extended quite some time happened all the time 2,500 years ago. So when soldiers were off at war and they didn't have their wives to be with, who did they turn to in the middle of the night when it was cold and freezing? Moreover, you read like the Socratic dialogues, you read Roman histories, they are replete with references to pederasty, that is, sexual relations between grown adults and children. Super common in Greco-Roman society. The Greeks and the Romans viewed this as part of forming young men into manhood. And in these mentor-mentee relationships, they often turned sexual. I'm not condoning it at all. What I'm saying is, when we see things like this in the Bible, it's not about homosexuality as we understand it. That is a modern concept of sexuality. When Jesus speaks against the Sodomites, he is addressing these relations between men and minors in Greco-Roman culture, not homosexuality. So when people weaponize the Bible in order to condemn gay people, like the Westboro Baptist Church, it's a complete misinterpretation and misunderstanding of the Bible. We have to understand the historical context. When we do, we can't weaponize it. Let me pause there with questions.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes.
If the Bible does not really address homosexuality and doesn't talk about homosexuality, why is the Catholic Church so much against it?
Well, because we have this funny little thing called natural law, right? And it's kind of a lovely thing in many ways, that in the natural world, bodies are built to procreate. And so not only do you have this thing in Scripture that says no vaginal intercourse, which for centuries we didn't understand what it was about, but when you look at the human body, you need a male and a female to procreate. And so any form of sex that does not do that, because you can't procreate, it's viewed as philosophically and inherently disordered. But the natural law is distinct from biblical theology. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Right. And so the Catholic Church's position is kind of this variety of factors kind of converging. But from the perspective of biblical theology, we could talk about natural law all day long, but from biblical theology, it never talks about homosexuality. It talks about sodomy, but that is not homosexuality.
I have a question.
Yes.
So if a person commits a crime here, it says they shall be put to death. So are they pro death sentence?
This is a really good question. And two things on this. One, and we don't really have the time to get into this, but there's a question of how much were these commandments actually practiced? And so some of these scholars really believe were never really carried out. But then again, we have the New Testament where the adulteress is about to be stoned, right? And Jesus says, throw it, let he who's without sin cast the first stone. And so when it comes to the question of like these laws that seem especially harsh, we have to understand that one, it was rebellion against surrounding Canaanite Babylonian culture that was brutally violent. And second, we have to look to the face of Jesus. Because in the Catholic Church, like he is the full revelation of God. And as much as I love the Hebrew Bible, ultimately, I look to the person of Christ. And so the question of capital punishment, great question. But I think the commandments that we're going to look at tonight are a lot more socially relevant than the ones about capital punishment. Technically, the church still allows capital punishment if there's no better alternative. But there are very few societies in which capital punishment is preferable over lifetime imprisonment or restorative imprisonment.
And can I come with a follow-up question too?
Yeah.
Reading what we were supposed to read and reading Exodus, and if you upset at your parents and all those things, you should capital punishment and all those things. So when you really look at Exodus and read those things we read in the papers you prepared, and you compare it today, where God is loving and forgiving, it's just a totally different world.
Totally. Yeah, and I think what we have to keep in mind is that ultimately all of these commandments, it's not about like, yeah, let's just kill everybody who offends, because otherwise everybody in society would be dead, right? If we were executing people left and right. But I think what they reveal is how seriously these relationships were taken with parents, with children, with our neighbors. Does that make sense?
Yeah, in some ways, but again, the question comes, so what do you read? Do you read the New Testament and toss away the Exodus and Leviticus and all those things? And actually, I think your theme, reading the Bible rebelliously, when I read all those things, I feel very rebellious against it.
Yeah. And remember, Jesus said, I've not come to abolish the Torah, I've come to fulfill it. And so the question is, in what ways does Jesus not totally eliminate the commandments, the 613 commandments, but how does he shift them and perfect them? And that includes the laws about violence.
So there's a question on chat that might connect
Yeah.
to this. The question is, and what about the meaning of abomination? Is the meaning of that more through the years?
Yes, and so the word abomination, the Hebrew, I forget what it is, actually refers to the Canaanite gods. So like the Canaanite bull-headed god, the Baal El, was often referred to as abomination. And my mind is kind of fuzzy on the linguistic connection, But whenever the word abomination is used in the Hebrew Bible, it is drawing a connection to the Canaanite gods who asked for human sacrifice, who created humans to be slaves to the gods. Honore, you had a question?
I was just curious, as far as the Catholic religion, were the priests always not allowed to marry? When
No.
did that happen?
So actually there are, when we talk about the Catholic Church, we have the Roman Catholic Church,
Right,
and then we have 22 other rites
Yeah.
in the Catholic Church: Syro-Malabar, Greek, Russian, Melkite, Maronite. The Roman Catholic Church is the only church that doesn't allow priests to marry. And that is because in the 1200s, priests, when they could marry, were passing their property on to their children. And so the rule against clerical marriage came about because priests were abusing their status.
right.
And they
Well,
were
that
giving-
means it all comes out down to the almighty dollar, that the church really wanted to protect the assets. And
Exactly.
that's where they said, well, you cannot marry. And the church probably doesn't want to support a family.
Right, totally. Anyway, let me move on. Super briefly, the commandments against anything in the seas that does not have fins or scales, right? So no shrimp, no lobster, no oysters, no clams. That's because, anybody have any ideas why 2,500 years ago would you prohibit eating shellfish?
Guessing because people got sick.
Yeah, it's super practical. Bottom dwellers are disgusting, right? They basically filter garbage through their bodies the entire time. One of my friends who has background in marine biology, this is kind of gross, but pardon my language, but it's funny. You know why people love oysters so much? It's because 2/3 of an oyster during season is just oyster semen. That's why people are like, oyster's so creamy. Not to be gross, but really people love the reproductive fluids within an oyster. Shellfish are really easy to get sick from if you don't eat them when they're properly stored. And in an age before refrigeration, well, let's make a commandment against it. Why no pigs? Why no pork? Because pigs eat way more food than they actually produce by weight. And so it's economically unsustainable to live off of pork. It's not because pigs are dirty, it's because they're just bad economics. So here's what I want to drive across, and we're about to get into small group discussion. In Judaism, relationship with God is not determined by what I believe. In other words, intellectual assent. So in Christianity, there's been this emphasis on orthodoxy, right belief, orthos dokeo. I believe in one Lord, the Almighty Father, creator of heaven and earth, et cetera, et cetera. The creeds, what do we believe? If I can say I believe X, Y, and Z, then I am a Christian. If I believe Jesus is the Son of God, rose from the dead, I can go out and murder, eviscerate neighborhood cats. But I am still a Christian because I believe. I might be a bad Christian, bad in the sense of I might be immoral, but I'm still a Christian. We have forgotten the Jewish roots of Christianity. And I'm going to show you what I mean based on Jesus' own words in a bit. But in Judaism, one believes in God. One exists in relationship with God through relationship with the world around us. You sit down and you read all 613 commandments, you get a pretty solid sense of what it means to live in the world. Oh, Jack is knocking around the stand. And if we focus so much on just believing, right, then we get the prosperity gospel. If I believe in God, God will give me money and wealth and fame. If I believe in God, I don't need to act justly and mercifully It is so easy to become vicious and cruel if belief is the only thing about my religion that I value. That is belief in an intellectual way. And so what we're going to do in small group, if you go to page 7 of the reading, I gave you a bunch of commandments just for your happy perusal. But if you go to page 7, there are these commandments about the Anawim and Justice. And throughout the Hebrew Bible, we see references to the Anawim. Anal in Hebrew means weak. It's an adjective. So the Anawim are the weak ones. And whenever there are commandments about the Anawim, it usually references 3 categories of people: the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. The widow, because women had no property rights in ancient Judea. And so if a woman's husband got killed at war or whatever, then she would have to marry one of his brothers. This was a way of protecting her and protecting the family because women could not own property. But nonetheless, she was a vulnerable member of society. The orphan, same thing as today, kid without parents, vulnerable. The immigrant, same thing as today. If I move to a new country, I don't know the language, I have no address, I have no job. How do I survive? And in an age where these big empires were fighting all the time, there were often these wanderers, these gur, these immigrants from other nations. And so these commandments, which we're going to get into, are about protecting the most vulnerable in society. And so we're going to break into small groups. Rio is going to, do you know how to do breakout rooms?
I think so. Oh, okay.
Leaf is going to set up breakout rooms. And here's the deal. Breakout room 1 is going to look at the first 3 commandments on page 7, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. How many are there? Okay, we'll do 2. Group number 2 is going to look at Leviticus 19, Deuteronomy 24, and Exodus 23. So the next 3.
So repeat that again.
Yes.
Before I put them in the groups, and then you can visit each group and remind them again.
Yeah, so group 1, the first 3 commandments on page 7. Group 2, the second 3 commandments on page 7.
Okay, folks, here you go into your groups. If your group is not labeled, we'll get to you and let you know right away.
And so what I want you to do before we go, 2 things. 1, read through these commandments and discuss what they mean. What are they trying to do? Who are they trying to protect and why? And secondly, think about in what ways might our culture and society in the 21st century apply these to our world. Any questions?
I think we're good.
All right.
Here we go. Okay.
Let me go to the other breakout room.
Can't hear, can't hear.
We can't hear you.
I think you're muted.
How's it now? Can you hear me?
Better, much better.
Cool.
Yes.
All right, let's hear. Group one, the first three commandments. What do you got? Talk to us.
They were all about taking care of the Anawim, the widows and the orphans, the immigrants, the people at the bottom.
Okay. I will admit these are the most vague of all the commandments. You got kind of the hardest ones almost because they're almost too simple. But yeah, like these are essentially thesis statements where they are placed in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. These are kind of like introductory and summarizing statements for all the commandments that surround them. And so we see in the Exodus chapter 22 one that it's like your identity came from enslavement and immigration into a new country. And so whenever there's somebody in your midst who is alien to you, liberate them. What else? Any other comments on the first three? Well, let's move to group two. And if group one has anything else they want to add, say the word.
Well, in our group, Gregory had a good point about you're not just leaving the leavings of the field, but you should leave that bothered him, that all the people were getting was the leftovers kind of stuff. But I think we read into it a little more, and it sounded like they would leave some rows, some actual good grapes and things behind too, not just the bad stuff or leftovers. So we thought that would be an interesting practice for today. To share with the poor community. I would invite them in, but I feel like these days it seems like they're trying to get everything they can off of a field and not leaving anything behind.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, that it's not just about like restaurants donating food that's about to be spoiled to those who are hungry.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about an agricultural society, if every farmer leaves the outside perimeter of their field for people who are hungry, who are traveling to pick from, that's a totally different ballgame.
Yeah, true.
It's like a modern day food bank.
Yeah, and it's totally, and I would argue that it even goes beyond what a food bank does, because a food bank is like giving of our
surplus.
Our surplus, exactly. Whereas this is like, no, of your field, right? The land that you sustain yourself on, part of that isn't for you.
Mm-hmm. Goes back to community. Mm-hmm. What responsibility for the other, for the people you live with, which, we're, I don't want to generalize, but, this nation was built on individualism, and we forget the idea is that we're responsible for other people, and that's goes back to our religious foundation and human beliefs.
It goes back to Cain and Abel.
Yes.
What have you done to where's your brother? I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? In other words, am I responsible for my brother? right? The story of Cain and Abel is where the word sin, chata, first appears in the Bible.
But like it was said, it all comes down to community. One for all for one.
What about Exodus chapter 23, verses 10 through 13? For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the wild animals may eat. You shall do the same with your vineyard and with your olive orchard.
That's protecting us from being workaholics.
Yeah, it's protecting us from workaholics. So that's like the next line, 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, so that your ox and your donkey may have relief, and your homeborn slave and the resident alien may be refreshed. But what's it saying about agriculture?
Well, it's a healthier way of
Farming.
producing things, because you're not overusing the soil, the nutrients. You're allowing it to reestablish itself. So you're not taking everything out of it and putting nothing back.
Right.
Exactly, right. So if I imagine, I don't have a whiteboard here, but imagine that I have a plot of land and it's divided into 7 parcels. This doesn't mean that 1 year out of every 7 I don't eat. It means that 1/7 of my land at any given time is being rotated out of active growing and harvesting and farming. Right? And I just let the land do what it will. And so not only is the Sabbath the recreative act of God built into the work week, it's built into how we approach the land, so that even wild animals can partake of the bounty.
But it also teaches you that you have 6 years' time to prepare for 7 years of needs.
Anything else from group 2? All right, I saved the coolest one for Honor A. So,
I have a question though.
yes.
In the Exodus 23, when they talk about your homeborn slave and the resident alien, are they using the word alien there as another word for slave?
Not necessarily. Usually it's like an immigrant, a traveler who came into my country from another land.
Okay.
Due to famine or war. So Honore is going to treat us to.
He is. This is a big, long one.
So we're on Deuteronomy 15, the Sabbath year.
But it's basically just rules that are written up to keep society at a balance, to keep a community going. If there's among you anyone in need, a member of your community in any of your towns within the land that the Lord God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor. You should rather open your hand, willingly lending enough to meet the need, whatever it may be. Be careful that you do not entertain a mean thought, thinking the 7th year, the year of remission, is near, because the rule was that every 7th year you shall grant a remission of debts. And this is the manner of the remission. Then they go on to say, every creditor shall remit the claim that is held against a neighbor, not exacting it of a neighbor who is a member of the community, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you may exact it, but you must remit your claim on whatever any member of your community owes you.
So
Maybe he
why
can
does
explain.
slavery exist in the Bible? As a form of labor, right? It's not chattel slavery, ladies and gentlemen. It's not what we had in the early American colonies. It is a profoundly different story. And so every 7 years, whatever slaves, indentured servants I had, I would have to set free. I would have to forgive any debt they owed me every 7 years. This prevents what?
Greed.
Abuse. Somebody up there?
Greed?
Greed, generational poverty, cyclical slavery, all the things that plague. This should make our blood run cold, right? Like, poverty in our country is generational. It's inherited. It's cyclical. Injustice perpetuates injustice. And the Sabbath, Honor and I were talking about this, but like God's recreative act reverberates throughout the economic, the cultural, the societal life of the ancient Jews. This is about restoring people to community, to fullness, to wholeness. It's not punitive justice. Anybody seen Ava DuVernay's 13th? Brilliant documentary on Netflix. It talks about how the 13th Amendment that basically permits slavery to continue through our prison system. These commandments, though, are about restoring people to relationship with the community. Not just people, but the land itself. Wild animals partake in this restoration, in this entirely new vision. So let me ask a question with all of this in mind. How does somebody get to heaven? Who's going to be saved? This might seem like a weird question now, but you'll see where I'm going. I want to hear your thoughts. How do I get to heaven?
Follow the commandments.
Follow the commandments.
Works of justice and goodness.
Justice and goodness.
Serve others.
Love your fellow man.
This has to do with love your fellow man, especially.
Yeah, I think that.
Mhm,
Be generous and welcoming.
mhm.
To be fair, to be generous and welcoming. So wait, you're telling me that repenting and believing in the Lord is not enough?
Well, as it said in a joke I just read recently, you have to die first.
That's true.
I would say it's your belief in God and following whatever He commands, and also how you treat your fellow human being.
Mhm, mhm. Good works, which is what you said at the beginning. What makes a good Christian? Didn't you say something about that?
But today we're taught that it's not by works that we're saved, it's by grace.
By grace, okay. And how does grace operate in the world? It's gratuitous, right? It's free, it's unearned, it's unmerited. We're undeserving. But how does the Spirit of God operate in this world? And so here, I want to read.
Through us.
Sorry, go for it. Through what?
Through us.
Through us, exactly. So I want to reframe our thinking about salvation, not through orthodoxy, but through orthopraxy.
Mhm.
It's not just in praying the Jesus prayer. It's not just in intellectually assenting, but it's through praxis, through action. And so essentially there are three models of salvation that have been posited by theologians throughout Christian history. There's the exclusivist model. And exclusivists have been around since the beginning of Christianity. Says that, well, only if you believe in Jesus will you go to heaven. It's
Right.
called the exclusivist because it excludes most people from heaven. Because most people who have ever lived have not believed in Jesus, right?
They don't
Right.
know about Jesus.
Yeah. The inclusivist says that non-Christians can go to heaven. Not that they will, but that they can. And it includes non-Christians in the economy of salvation. The universalist says that, well, everybody goes to heaven automatically because the love of God is so profound and overwhelming and infinite that God would not send anybody to hell. However, let's look at what Jesus says. In Matthew chapter 25, we have the single most vivid picture of heaven and hell that Jesus speaks. It's the sheep and the goats. When the Son of, and what I want you to pay attention, ask yourselves, who does Jesus say will go to heaven and what is required? Not that this is all about heaven, mind you. And you'll see why I say that in a moment. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Remind me, people, what language did Jesus speak?
Aramaic.
Aramaic, right, which is derivative of Hebrew, right? Hebrew is the formal religious written language. Aramaic is the common colloquial language. Guess what Hebrew word Jesus probably said in that phrase, "the least of these"?
Anawim.
Anawim, right? So when Jesus was speaking in Aramaic to his audience, and somebody passed these words down over the years before they were written down in Matthew, whatever Jews were hearing it were remembering the widow, the orphan, the immigrant. These commandments about the harvest and the slave were resonating in their minds. Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry and you gave me no food. I was thirsty and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger and you did not welcome me, naked and you did not give me clothing, sick and in prison and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly, I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, to the Anawim, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." So, where in all of that, any of it, and this is in the Google Doc, does Jesus say, "Believe in me to get to heaven"?
Nowhere.
Nowhere, right?
Mhm.
Nowhere.
Mhm.
What strikes me about this passage is that neither the saved nor the damned know why they are saved or damned, right? This is on Judgment Day. This is the end of times when everyone is gathered before Jesus and they don't know why they're saved or damned. Karl Rahner, the Jesuit, one of the most important Catholic theologians of the past 100 years, almost single-handedly prompted the Second Vatican Council in his theology to assert that non-Christians can go to heaven. Rahner had this idea of the anonymous Christian, that one can serve Jesus without believing in him. And Jesus says, if you do it to the Anawim, the naked, the imprisoned, the hungry, the sick, the immigrant, you are serving me. That doesn't require believing in him. All that requires is looking our neighbor in the eyes, seeing them, hearing them, and loving them into their humanity.
So my question comes up right now is, so where are the days where it was said, if you weren't Catholic, you're not going to heaven? If you're
I
not-
know, right? I know.
And
Well,
today
we
it's
have
the
to
same
read the
thing.
gospel. What does the gospel say?
If you're not one of those 265,000 saved ones, Jehovah Witnesses, you're not going to go to heaven. So,
I know, we're screwed.
yeah, absolutely. So that's really, look again, I'm and again, being rebellious in reading things. Look what the Catholic Church has taught us over the years. Where do we take that?
Mhm.
And so, before I open up to final discussion questions, I want to throw this at you, because this, I think, is a game changer. It was for me the more I've thought about this. In the Gospel of John, I'm the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. What is belief in a Jewish mindset?
I don't know.
It is about action. Relationship with God is lived through action, through praxis. And so when we think about salvation and heaven, almost every reference to heaven in the Bible is about a new heavens and a new earth. Heaven isn't about going somewhere else. It's about the recreation of this world. So what if salvation is more like salving, healing of the world's woundedness, bloodiness, pains, injustices? Right? What if salvation is not out there, but it is here among us if we are working for it?
Uh-huh.
And so I'll leave you with that, but I want to open it to discussion. What are your thoughts? What surprises you? What shifts your understanding? What do you disagree with? What's confusing?
Well, my question is, when does heaven start? The day you die, or until the very last day of final judgment?
I think heaven starts in our lives.
I think it's here now.
Yeah, I think it starts in our lives. The way we live.
Can you hear Honore? He's saying he thinks it starts now. It starts with our lives, the way we live.
Mhm.
So we read in the Bible that when you go to heaven, there's no more pain, no more suffering. So if heaven is here on earth,
A lot of suffering.
will we ever experience that freedom of suffering and discourse and pain?
My own inclination is to say it's not the earth as we know it now.
Otherwise, it would be mighty crowded.
Yeah, but to what degree are we ushering the kingdom into this world?
Mhm.
Seems to me too.
Well, and they also say, and I believe that the kingdom is already among us. So,
Right? Like, why are you looking up? Look around you.
right. And it's in all of us and around us. So this idea of heaven for me has changed. I have, I'm not counting on going to a place after I die, other than somewhere in the earth, the body. But I think my soul will be some other place.
Will it be
So,
closer to God?
I've just given up on, oh gosh, have I done enough? Because, to get into heaven, it's like, well, my job is right here now. and I need to do the best I can with compassion and mercy, without judgment, and have joy. I mean,
I think that's where my belief in that, the fact that people who were never Christian or never even heard of Jesus Christ, they lived a fully human, fully alive, where other people were important to them, animals and the planet was important to them. The things that their lives were about were not just selfishness and accumulation. It was more like, who next to me needs something, who over there is someone I can do something for, or when their interactions, whether it was people or animal, they were cognizant of something beyond just your physical human body. You needed to reach out and be a part of whatever you lived in, whether it was in community or otherwise. They were individuals, or anybody who's ever lived their life as conscious that it's important, the fact that you're alive and that what you do in your life is important, because, you know, there was just so much in some individuals you've heard about in life who probably were never baptized Catholic, that's for sure, who were definitely what's God's idea of why he put us here on this earth.
To follow that, I remember my good old Catholic school days and trying to learn the catechism as a kid, and talking about that very thing, you know, what we had to do to go to heaven and believe in Jesus and so forth. And the question came up, and the answer that I remember was, if this little pagan person is sitting in the jungle on a log and never had the opportunity to learn about Jesus, how can they get to heaven? And I've often thought about that log, and you know, that sticks with me.
And in modern times, we found these people in Africa who have never heard of Jesus, who have this whole written or non-written thing that sounds just like our belief in Jesus. It's a spiritual something, I forget where it came, I heard about in the 70s, but you know, where they have this verbalized prayer that almost sounds like our creed in a way. But it wasn't on Jesus, it was on this spiritual belief thing.
You know, we can second guess everything today, but bottom line is, we just got to leave it in his hand. He's going to decide, and he's the one who decides for everybody. And I think he's not going to look, are you Muslim? Are you Jewish? Are you Christian? Are you non-Christian? Are you non-believer? You know, and that's really what belief comes about, is you got to believe it in him.
I just wanted to add that I think looking at when Jesus died and was resurrected, I mean, what happened to the disciples was it took away their fear to live out the kingdom in this world, even if it meant death. And so in that way, it's like, what can they take from us if what we have is God's love and we want that for everybody, and justice and living out the gospel in that way. And so it doesn't really matter what happens after we're dead. I mean, that's just my belief.
I have a question.
Real loud, Linda, we can't hear you well.
I have a question. So if heaven is here among us, my question is, my mother had dementia, and through my eyes, she had no quality of life left. She couldn't care for herself. She couldn't make decisions. Her body was weak, and she couldn't go anywhere or walk anywhere. she was laying in bed to the point of bed sores. And I asked myself, why does God keep her alive, keep her breathing? And now I'm wondering, did God keep her breathing so that I would learn greater compassion and care for someone who was poor in spirit? Was that heaven teaching me? So that's my question. Do we learn to serve and include those who are the poor? Are the poor here to teach us what the kingdom truly is?
Mhm.
My dad had Parkinson's, and with that dementia, my mom currently has dementia, but my dad passed away a few years ago. So I had the exact same questions. Yeah, and he taught for 30 years, and at his like retirement dinner at the school where he taught, he said, I hope that in my teaching, I've taught my students how to live, and now I hope I can teach them how to die. And he said this kind of frozen in his chair. He couldn't get up from the Parkinson's. But yeah, not that I used his dementia or his death like as a thing to profit from in my own like understanding and wisdom, but there is that engraced gift there.
Mhm.
Very much so.
I asked my mom, I said, what makes you happy? Because I'd go and visit her and she was happy, yet she had nothing to live for. And her response to me was, seeing you makes me happy.
Dave, any final words?
Yeah. So when we look at the Gospel of Luke, and he picks up the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and he's like, I have come to set the captive free. I have come to liberate the oppressed. I have come to restore sight to the blind and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. He's quoting the prophet Isaiah, but the prophet Isaiah is referring to these commandments. What is the year of the Lord's favor? It's the Jubilee year. It's the Sabbath year, when debts are forgiven, when slaves are released. And so Jesus quotes the prophets more than anyone else. Next month, we're going to be looking at the prophets. That's my great love in the Bible. They're completely misunderstood as predicting the coming of Jesus. They never mention Jesus. And so next month, we're going to try to recover what the radicality of the prophets. So yeah, feel free to email me if you have any questions or lingering thoughts. But thank you so much for your time, and see you in a few weeks.
Yay.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Great
Yeah.
job,
Thank
Dave.
you.
Dave.
Thank
Thanks, everybody. Wonderful discussion.
Mhm. Yes.
Next month.
15.
Mhm. Good night. Peace.
I also think having the
Thank you for
readings
getting your reading.
ahead of time and prepare helps quite a bit too.
Mhm.
For sure.